Hello, loud. Hello. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Macondo Literary Session. Today we're going to be talking about writing the self, and I am just so delighted to welcome Janika Oza and Jeferson Tenório to join us today, and to all of you. I hope that over the next hour we have together, we'll explore all the ways that it means to think about oneself, both in terms of your relationship with others, your relationship with place, and your relationship with history. And we're joined by Quinn, who's going to be translating for us. Thank you so much, Quinn.
You're welcome.
So we'll spend about 30 to 40 minutes having a conversation between the three of us, and then we'll do 30 minutes with any questions or comments you might have. So anything you think of, just make a note of it, and we'll get around to it. All right, welcome. So I think where I'd like to begin is I'll read a little bit of a bio, but then I would like to know how you would like yourself to be known to us here in Macondo in this moment. Okay. Janika Oza is the author of the novel A History of Burning, which has won multiple awards, including winner of the 2024 Asian Pacific American Award for Literature, a finalist for the 2023 Governor General's Award for Fiction, a finalist for the 2024 Carol Shields Prize, and a New York Times Editor's Choice. She's an assistant editor for The Rumpus and lives in Toronto. Janika, how would you like to be known to us in this moment?
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay. It's so lovely to be here. It's a difficult question already. I think I would say, first of all, being here in Nairobi, being in Kenya is so special, so meaningful to me. This is my first time being in Kenya, but ancestrally, my family is from India, but my great-grandfather moved to Kenya to work at a railway station. And then my family was here and in Uganda until the expulsion. And so being here, I think introducing myself that way holds a different weight and feels really wild and amazing and special to be able to say that in this room. And so I think that's what I would add onto my bio.
Thank you. And I was at Shabnam Khan's session earlier and we were talking about home. So I'd like to say welcome to a home. Jeferson Tenório was born in Rio de Janeiro in 1977. Based in Porto Alegre, he holds a PhD in literary theory from PUCRS. He's been a newspaper columnist, visiting professor of literature at Brown University in the US. He has had texts adapted for the theater and short stories translated into English and Spanish. He's the author of Estela Sem Dios, 2018. And I'm going to try this. O Avesso da Pele in 2020, The Dark Side of Skin, which won the 2021 Jabuti Prize for the best novel published in Brazil. Jeferson, I say from another sea to the sea, also welcome to you. And how would you like to be known to us here today?
Obrigado pela apresentação, é um prazer estar aqui. Estou muito feliz de estar a primeira vez no Quênia. Estou sendo muito bem recebido. E não sei se...
Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure being here. It's my first time here, and again, thank you for having me.
No Brasil, eu também sou pesquisador de literaturas luso-africanas e tinha e tenho na minha cabeça um imaginário sobre a África e sobre os países africanos. E para mim é extremamente emocionante estar aqui e conhecer também um pouco da literatura e da história do Quênia.
I'm also a Luso-African researcher at Brazil, and I've always had this place in mind and being here, it's a great opportunity to meet the actual place.
E certamente levarei uma experiência muito rica e que, de certo modo, também vai acabar interferindo também na minha escrita e na minha experiência com a literatura. E é dessa forma que eu gostaria de ser conhecido.
And this will also be a very enriching experience, and it will greatly affect the way I write. And this is the way I would like to present myself or to be known to all of you.
Thank you very much. So I have to tell all of you all, if you haven't read the work, it is stunning. I gobbled the books up. Literally, I read each book in one day. They are expansive and beautiful, very vividly written works. And for both of them, the word that comes to mind is tender, actually. So both books explore kind of multi-generational families set in very specific places and times. And so to start with, I'd like for you to maybe share a little bit about the worlds in which these characters belong and what it was that drew you to them.
So the world of this novel is a moving, changing world. I think, when we were talking yesterday in the opening session about the sea as history and what the sea means to us, for me, I was thinking, well, the sea is something that's always moving, right? The sea doesn't rest. And that's the history of my family. And that's the history and the story in this book. I just mentioned my sort of family trajectory, and that is what drew me to writing this novel. Is I knew about this sort of like long, multiple migrations in my family, all the way up to, I was the first person in my family to be born in Canada. And so it's, all the way up until that. But at the same time, there was so much I didn't know about my family history. There was such silence. And so for me, I was very drawn to that silence. I knew there was a story in that silence. And I felt such an urgency to kind of move towards it and understand it better and uncover the layers of story. And so, yeah, that is really what brought me into the work. And then once I began that process, I mean, we can talk about that later because it's probably a whole other question. But yeah, so for me, I'm really thinking about that sort of constant journeying, constant movement, the idea that maybe there's no such thing as arrival, at least in this novel, at least for these characters. And yet there is still this sort of constant making and remaking of home.
And the book spans, I think, 3 continents, isn't it? I'm going to read what it's about. I realized I forgot to do that, so I want to also make sure that you all are placed. History is burning. India, 1898. Pirbai is the 13-year-old breadwinner for his family when he steps into a dhow on the promise of work, only to be taken across the ocean to labor on the East African Railway for the British. A profoundly moving debut novel spanning India, Uganda, 4 continents, India, Uganda, England, and Canada, about how one act of survival reverberates across generations of a family and their search for a place of their own. This thing that you just mentioned, Janika, about a sense of kind of always looking, always roving, I think it's the same feeling that I got in Jeferson's novel, even whilst Jeferson's is a little bit more planted in a certain space in Brazil. I still felt that a similar kind of restlessness. So I will tell you what Jeferson's book is about and then ask you the same question. The Dark Side of Skin. Life under Brazil's brutal cordial racism comes painfully alive in this novel of fathers and sons. It is an archaeology of affectations, but also of life in southern Brazil, where being Black on the streets of Porto Alegre manifests violences large and small. Jeferson Tenório takes on fathers and sons, Shakespeare and Cervantes, and the inescapable bonds and burdens of family and history in one delicately rendered, painfully precise account of loved ones lost and found. Can you tell us a little bit about the world of this novel and what drew you to it?
Eu nasci no Rio de Janeiro, perto do mar. E na escola onde eu estudava, eu conseguia ver a praia. E muitas vezes eu não assistia a aula e ia para a praia escondido dos professores.
I was born at Rio de Janeiro, which is a coastal city, and there was always the beach nearby. So oftentimes, instead of going to school, to my class, I will go to the beach and sit there.
O mar, para mim, era um brinquedo, um lugar onde eu podia me divertir, assim como a areia, assim como jogar futebol, assim como fazer qualquer outra coisa que eu gostava até os meus 12 anos de idade.
The sea was like, or the beach and the sea, they were like toys or entertainment for me. Be it the sand, playing football, or doing anything that came to mind. And up until I was 12 years old, this was my main source of entertainment.
Mas um dia, aos 12 anos de idade, eu resolvi pegar uma prancha de surf, e eu não sabia surfar, e decidi sair de Copacabana e ir fazer o retorno no mar, né, até chegar em Ipanema.
So when I turned 12, I decided to take this surfboard, even though I didn't know how to surf. And I decided to go from Copacabana through the sea all the way to Ipanema.
Eu achei que era uma brincadeira, mas era algo bastante sério. Veio uma onda muito alta e me jogou para muito fundo no mar, e eu fui salvo por um surfista.
I thought it was child's play, but then this massive wave came on top of me and it made me tumble all the way to the bottom of the sea, and I had to be saved by this other surfer.
Quando eu voltei para a areia, e bastante assustado e tossindo muito e tremendo, porque eu quase morri nesse dia, foi a primeira vez que eu olhei para o mar.
So when I came back to the land, I was shaking, I was in fear because I had just nearly lost my life. And this was the first time that I properly looked at the sea.
E eu acho que nesse momento eu deixei de ser criança e me tornei um adulto, porque eu percebi que o mar era um abismo preenchido de água salgada.
And I think at this point I stopped being a child and I became an adult as I realized that the sea is this massive
Um grande abismo
this
preenchido por água salgada.
this massive abyss filled with salty water.
E um ano depois eu vou para o sul do Brasil, no Rio Grande do Sul, que é onde eu vou viver durante 30 anos, longe do mar.
And afterwards I moved to Rio Grande do Sul, and this is where I lived for 30 years, far from the sea.
E talvez por viver longe do mar, eu tenha escrito um livro como o The Dark of the Skin.
And maybe due to living so far from the sea, I managed to write the book,
O Avesso da Pele.
The Dark of the Skin.
É uma história muito dura, difícil e talvez muito seca, justamente porque vivi por muito tempo longe do mar.
Perhaps because I lived so long after the sea, this book comes out as very harsh and very dry.
E para finalizar, eu acho que consegui preservar um pouco da minha relação com o mar, porque eu sou muito econômico nas lágrimas e sou muito econômico também quando eu suo, e eu acho que é um modo de preservar um pouco desse mar interno que eu tenho e trazer um pouco de humanidade para os meus personagens.
And I think I was able to retain a bit on the sea through the way in which I cry very little and in which I sweat very little. And I think I managed to retain the sea in order to bring life into my characters in my books.
There's so many ways that your work speaks to each other. It's really quite stunning. One of the things that I'm left thinking about is in both your work how sometimes the characters are saved by others, and this idea that we exist as a self but only in relationship to the ones around us. And I'd love to ask you both a little bit about, I think, really the characters and the histories that they inherit and how that then shapes the future that they're trying to create for themselves. Janika, maybe we can start with you.
Yeah, I love that question. I think that is so central to this book and so central to what I was thinking about when I was writing. When I was writing this book, in order to write it, I had to speak to so many people, because this is a history that I'm descended from, but I didn't live through it. And so I felt really, in order to write this book and to do it justice, I had to speak to my family. I had to speak to my community, even though my family and community didn't speak about, the things that happened, because they're difficult or painful. And, there's this sort of mentality of just bury it and move forward. But I felt that, in order to really to write the book I wanted to write, I had to. And so it became this sort of community project, writing this book. It became this act of kind of collective remembering, which was truly like, of everything that has happened since beginning this book until now, which is, it's been about 8 years at this point since I started it. That is continues to be the most meaningful part for me, was that sort of gathering of stories and like coming together with community, with family, and just storytelling, and me just sort of like sitting and listening to that, and over years and years, and then sort of translating that into a story, a fictional story, but sort of absorbing all of that over years. And so I think that is all about relationships, right? And me building relationships. And this book, to me, all I wanted to do, or what I wanted to do at the heart, was really to honor that, and to honor that kind of like generational memory. When I was speaking to people, I was speaking to people who were in their 80s, and who were like, oh, they've never talked about these things before, but suddenly they're like, wait, it's going to die with me. Actually, I want to talk about it. There's this sort of like change in mentality. And then I was speaking to people who are more in my parents' generation, in their mid-60s, and then people in my generation who would sort of be on these like Zoom calls that I was having in my interview process to like work the technology, but they would be a part of the story too, and I just wanted to honor that kind of generational memory and the sort of like gathering. And so this book very much does reflect that. It is 4 generations of one family, over the course of 100 years, and it's really always thinking about threading these lives together, and how one cannot exist without the others.
And it really does feel like that. You feel it in the form of the novel too, this kind of gathering, and that beautiful term that you use, collective remembering. And I'm really struck by how here we have, even just kind of the geographical representation in this space. And within Macondo, I mean, both of these novels do overlap in terms of time. And I think about that collective remembering that's happening in spaces around the world at the same time, but being experienced both differently and the same. And I wondered, maybe Jeferson, if you'd like to talk a little bit more to that idea of experiencing things at the same time across different spaces.
Eu penso que a literatura, para mim, sempre foi um acerto de contas com o território onde eu vivi, especificamente no Rio Grande do Sul, que é um lugar bastante hostil e perigoso para as pessoas negras.
I think literature has always been an evening of accounts to me, especially since I'm from the South.
É um acerto de contas no território onde eu vivi, que é um lugar bastante hostil para pessoas negras.
Yes, and the South is a very hostile place to dark-skinned people.
E um acerto de contas significa lutar com as palavras e, ao mesmo tempo, preservar uma sensibilidade.
And this evening of accounts means fighting with words and at the same time retain some sensibility.
Mas não pensem que eu sou vingativo.
Please do not think that I'm a vengeful person.
Escrevo porque foi o modo que eu encontrei para conseguir lidar com todas as violências que eu e minha família passamos.
I write because this is the way I managed to find to cope or deal with all the violence that myself and my family had to go through.
Mas não significa que tudo que está no livro tem a ver com a minha vida especificamente.
That does not mean that everything that is in the book reflects my personal life.
Digo isso porque o meu protagonista, que se chama Henrique,
I say this because my protagonist, my main character, whose name Henrique,
é um professor de literatura que dá aulas em escolas públicas no Rio Grande do Sul.
Because this character, he's a teacher and he gives classes. He's a literature teacher and he gives classes at Rio Grande do Sul.
E que é brutalmente assassinado pela polícia após uma abordagem policial.
And he's brutally assassinated by the police during one of their brutal approaches.
E quem narra a história é o filho dele, o Pedro, que tem 22 anos.
And the narrator to this story is his son. His name is Pedro. He's 22 years old.
E certa vez, numa entrevista, uma jornalista perguntou como eu me sentia com a morte do meu pai, que foi assassinado pela polícia.
And during an interview, the interviewer, she asked him how he felt about the police because his father was also assassinated.
Mas meu pai está vivo e muito vivo.
But my father is very much alive.
E a experiência que eu tenho tido em outros territórios com essa história é uma experiência de identificação, porque as experiências negras ao redor do mundo são muito parecidas.
And the experience I have with this story throughout the world is a story of correlation, because there is a lot of similarities in the lives of Black people all over the world, or dark-skinned people all over the world.
Thank you. I think this is a good point to give you a little taste of the work. I'm going to ask Janika to read from A History of Burning, and we're going to read just opening pages from each of the novels, because I'm going to try and avoid spoilers as much as possible. And so you can get a little bit of a flavor of the language and the worlds. Janika, would you start us off?
Sure. So this is right from the start. The chapter is Pirbai, 1898. The last day Pirbai spent in Gujarat was ignited by a sun that could not last. The heat was a dry beast, scorching the fields yellow as Gora hair. He eased himself onto a step by the water's edge, letting his chappals graze the foam. Jamnagar offered him nothing. For as long as he could remember, every day was the same. By foot, or sometimes hitching a ride on the back of a cart, he wandered the streets, pleading for work. Today, the landowner barely raised his eyes, and he knew he was probably one of many boys turned away. Look around you, Dikro, the man had muttered. Do you see any rice, any grain? Dry, all dry. Come back after monsoon. When Pirbai pointed to the white buds bursting across a field, the man laughed until he coughed. His lips cracked and blood pulsed on his stained teeth. Those are for British exports, not for us. That morning, Pirbai had watched his ma ask the gods for forgiveness, praying over his middle sister whose bones clacked as though loose inside her skin. For days, her body had expelled water, sweat water, wee-wee water, chi water, and now she was limp and dry as the crops outside. When his ma had turned to him and told him to try Jamnagar today, that a neighbor's son had found work there last week, Pirbai had imagined saying no. He had thought about rolling over on his sleeping mat, refusing to leave home and playing gilli danda with his siblings in the deadened grass instead. They would fight over who got to be striker and who fielder, and as the eldest, Pirbai would get first pick. He would strike the gilli all the way to the sea, and his siblings would whistle, ma looking on in awe. But he was 13, the oldest son, no longer a boy. If he returned bearing nothing again, ma would suck in her cheeks, then silently scrape her portion onto his plate, a reminder of the strength he would need for tomorrow. Bhai, his mother always called him, brother, reminding him of who he was, to whom he was responsible. The reddening sky warned him to start his journey back, but the wind pulling off the water stilled him. He pressed his palms to his face, the imprint of the sun behind his eyelids a single ember. When he opened his eyes, there was a man, a merchant, his belt buckle polished and skin supple and oiled so that its brown shone almost gold. The man shifted a lump of tobacco in his cheek, exposing teeth like chipped bricks. Looking for work, Dikro? Pirbai nodded, eyeing him, too weary from the day to believe. The man opened his fist for a second. It was long enough for Pirbai to spy a pile of coins, grimy but solid, winking in the late afternoon light. You and I, we were meant to find one another, the man said, and pressed a coin into Pirbai's palm. Pirbai closed his fingers over the skin-warmed metal, unable to resist its unnatural weight. You have work? The man pointed out at the water. I'm looking for boys just like you, young, tough, hard-working. You'll work hard, no? Now Pirbai focused, aware that this was his chance. He raked a hand through his hair, relieved that he still appeared strong and capable, even as his stomach curled around itself. He smiled to show the man his teeth, that they were straight and square, his best feature, a sign of inner health, his ma always bragged. I'll work the hardest, he said, and he meant it. The man clapped him on the shoulder and fished into his pocket, drawing out two things. First, a small tin of tobacco, which he flipped open and offered to Pirbai. Tentatively, Pirbai accepted, taking a pinch and dabbing it inside his lip as he'd seen so many men do, languorous, restless men, hungry-eyed. His heart leapt, knowing that he might no longer be one of them. Beneath the tin of tobacco, the man shook out a long strip of paper. It was crisp and covered in small black etchings. Pirbai's spirit sunk. A test. He had hardly been to school, never learned to read. Now he would have to prove himself smart enough for the job, and he would fail. The man passed him the sheet of paper. He didn't ask Pirbai to read the words, or to recite a poem like the wealthy boys could, or to take up a pen and write. Instead, he produced a small cap of ink and tapped it open, gesturing to the line at the end of the page. If you want to work, you just need to put your thumbprint here, he said. Marveling at his luck, Pirbai let his right thumb sink into the pool of black, all the way until it hit the bottom.
We got swept away. Okay, the dark side of skin. May I read the beginning? sometimes you'd have a thought and go to live inside it, push everyone away, build a house that way, somewhere far, deep inside yourself. That was how you dealt with things. These days, I choose to think you left so you could come back to me. I didn't want your absence to be your only legacy. I wanted your presence, some form of it, even if it was painful and sad. And despite everything, here in this house, in this apartment, you'll always be a body dying over and over. You'll always be a father who refuses to leave. You were never that good at leaving. Until the end, you believed books could make a difference. You stepped in and out of life, and it remained bitter. Objects still hold memories of you, but it seems whatever's left of them can either only hurt or comfort me because they're remnants of affection. Silently, these objects speak of you. It's through them that I imagine and recover you. Through them, I try to find out about how many tragedies a person can take. Maybe I'm reaching for some truth, not as a destination, but as a journey that will sweep through these rooms and give me the first piece of a puzzle. A puzzle that begins behind the front door, where I find an orange terracotta bowl, and inside it a stone, a sacred okuta, wrapped in red, green, and white ribbons. I study it with care. That's how you enter a life that already left this earth. I take the okuta out of the bowl. I remember the day you told me your head was Ogun's, and that this was very lucky because Ogun was the only Orisha who could handle the void. I remember it was from your mouth I first heard the word void. There are words we hold on to when we're children because they bring us comfort. I remember now what my Aunt Luara told me to do when I met her Ogun. Wrap it in a cloth, hold it in your hands, and take it to the river, she said. Before leaving, I head to your room and look in from the doorway. There are clothes scattered on the floor, some more tossed in the wardrobe. On the table are inkless pens, unmatched socks under receipts from the grocery, notebooks and sheets of paper, folders filled with your students' tests and essays. Your chaos moves me. I look at all this and realize these are the objects that will help me narrate who you were before you left. The same tools that defeated you now speak to me about you. These objects will appear to me like your ghost. I have 2 pages of questions and we've gotten through 2, and I also don't want to be greedy. So I would like to ask you about tenderness, because you both write quite unflinchingly about worlds that are difficult, in which the characters are very much present to the systems that make life difficult. And yet tenderness just is so deeply embedded in the relationships and in the story. Was that intentional? Was that... I guess I'm not even sure exactly what my question is, as much as it's so stark to me, and I'm wondering if it was something that was an intentional exploration.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I love the word tenderness, and I think when I was writing this book, it is a book that's very much looking at, big historical, political structures, movements, and oppressions, and looking at very painful stories and histories across communities. And I wanted to, always from the start, I wanted to look at everything head on in writing this book. I didn't want to shy away from writing about British colonialism and what it did. I didn't want to shy away from writing about the ways that that marginalized communities were pitted against each other because of the British, by design. I didn't want to shy away from the anti-Black racism within the South Asian community in Kenya and Uganda. And at the same time, I didn't want to shy away from the love and beauty and magic within the relationships, and just the complexity of all of that. And I think trying to hold all of that is a lot. And for me, what grounds the work is coming back to that idea of tenderness or love, and what it means to be a person in the world, at any time, any place. What it means to just be waking up in the morning and, whatever structures and governments and regimes that you're living under, you're still waking up in the morning and thinking about breakfast, or thinking about the person beside you in bed or the person not beside you in bed. And, there's these sort of like intimacies that make us human, and that I just, I wanted to pay attention to. And I think that kind of like attentiveness is a form of tenderness, that sort of like devotion to like the small, even in the face of the large, is tenderness, and is what has me writing. That's why I write, is because of that, and because of the large, and the ways that there are in fact no borders between them. And I think for many of us from marginalized communities or diasporic writers, I'm very much a diasporic writer. Like, I think that's very clear that that there are no boundaries or borders between like the big political and the small personal. And so just sort of like blurring that and allowing tenderness to sort of take up that space. Yeah.
I think what's so interesting is, and this really only struck me now, is for both novels, the way in which the tenderness often feels most like pulsating is in the gaps when we aren't together, when the character is not with the person they are pining for. And in The Dark Side of Skin, it's a young man writing or addressing his father. And even the form of it, the you voice, is so intimate. And it's that relationship between father-son, both tenderness, but also sometimes disappointment. What was it that interested you in exploring that particular relationship? And did anything surprise you?
Quando eu pensei em escrever O Avesso da Pele, eu já sabia que era uma história violenta, uma história brutal.
When I thought about writing The Dark of the Skin, I already knew that it would be a violent and brutal story.
E a única forma de escrever essa história seria pela delicadeza e pela ternura.
And the only way to write a story will be through tenderness and gentleness.
Porque eu queria que o leitor ficasse com o melhor desses personagens e não com o pior da política.
Because I wanted every reader not to come out with the ugly side of the politics, but with the brightest side of each character.
Eu queria que os meus leitores entendessem o que significa entrar na casa de um pai morto.
I wanted my readers to understand what it meant for someone to walk into the house of a dead father.
E mais do que a tristeza desse momento, mas a possibilidade de imaginar e criar uma nova relação com esse pai.
And more so than the sadness and sorrow of that moment, the possibility of building a new relationship with this father.
E a escolha por escrever através da delicadeza foi também porque entendo que o afeto e a imaginação também são atos de resistência.
And the choice to use tenderness is because I understand that affection and imagination também são
modos de resistência.
There are also forms of resistance.
Era preciso oferecer uma história em que eu pudesse descrever a intimidade e a sensibilidade desses personagens sem recorrer à violência.
I needed to be able to write a story in which I can present the tenderness and sensibility of these characters without resorting to violence.
Até porque a literatura não é violenta, o que é violento é a vida.
And even we all know that it's not literature that's violent, it's the life that's violent.
Por isso, quando eu escrevo, eu procuro escrever aquilo que eu tenho de melhor, para poder oferecer também melhor aos leitores.
So when I write, I look to write what I can offer the best so that the reader also takes the best out of what I read or what I write.
Thank you. Oh. Very reluctantly, so reluctantly, I'm going to pause my questions. And I'd like to invite questions and also reflections, thoughts you may have. I'm benevolent that way. But my request, please, is if you can keep them tight so that we can try and get as many thoughts and questions as possible. We'll take 2 at a time. Yeah? Okay, we have one over there and one over here.
Thank you for writing such a great book. I'm currently reading it, and from the much I've read, I see a chronicle of the oppressed from Gujarat to Mombasa and so on. People are oppressed everywhere. It's like there's a common thread of oppression. My question is very simple. Is there hope for the oppressed?
Does someone else want to answer that? Thank you for reading the book. Thank you for that beautiful question. Absolutely. I think, I have chills with what Jeferson just said about tenderness as a form of resistance. I want that on a t-shirt, I think that is hope, right? That there are so many forms of resistance, and yes, there are oppressed people the world over, but there is tenderness amongst us, and there is community amongst us, and I guess those are the things that bring me hope, is finding community amongst other people, and that sort of solidarity among us, and being able to connect and share our stories, right? And then and form these sort of communities and bonds, and that makes us stronger. And so that gives me a feeling of strength, which gives me hope. Yeah, I think I will leave it there. Yeah, a big question, but thank you for it.
Jeferson, would you like to talk about hope?
Creio que ela já disse tudo.
I believe that Janika has said it all.
An efficient answer. Fantastic. We had a question down here and then one over there.
Hi. So in the process of sort of recollecting these intergenerational memories, did you encounter any gaps that just remained gaps, any questions that stayed unanswered? And did you feel any loss or grief or at what will forever remain unknown? Or any guilt at having to sort of improvise a bridge out of imagination? Yeah.
Thank you. What a beautiful question. Absolutely. I think that was something for me that was so present in researching and writing this book, was the absences, the ways that, I came to this book because of the silence that I was hearing, and I came away with so much more knowledge and understanding, and still an even greater understanding of how much silence there still is and how much I will never know. And there are, people who I would have loved to speak to, who I never met. I never met my grandmother. And if you've read the book, the character of Rajni is very much inspired by my grandmother and her journeys. And I would have loved to speak to her, and I never got to. So there was and is a persistent grief in knowing that, and that's something that I think I just have to, live with, sit with. But I will say that rather than a guilt with fiction, I think it's hope. I think it's what an amazing privilege to get to imagine, reimagine what I can't know. I never got to meet my grandmother, but what an amazing privilege and joy for me to get to write towards knowing her, even though I never got to in this life. I think it's so special. And I feel very fortunate to be able to do that, to imagine and through imagining sort of reclaim.
Thanks. Thank you for this incredible insights, beautiful conversation. I have only read Janika's book, and I will immediately be reading yours. But I had a question for both of you about wanting to or trying to articulate what I'm seeing as a double marginalization. So you're writing about countries or regions that have come from colonial histories, that have a specific kind of history of oppression when we think about the world. And within that, there are communities that are somehow experiencing another layer of that marginality, of that not belonging to the wider umbrella or the wider population. So I just wanted to ask you, what was the challenge of having to do that? How did you succeed?
So the challenge of this double marginalization. Great question.
Creio que na realidade brasileira nós tivemos nos últimos anos aumento do conservadorismo e do autoritarismo no Brasil.
I believe that in the Brazilian reality, for the past few years, we have an increase in conservatory value leanings and authoritarianism or authoritarianism in the nation.
No governo Bolsonaro, que foi eleito em 2018, tivemos muitos problemas com censura de livros, e que foi também o caso do Avesso da Pele.
During Bolsonaro's rule, he was a president in Brazil, there was a lot of censure done to books, and that this is the same case that happened with the Dark of the Skin book.
E mesmo que o governo Bolsonaro não esteja mais no poder, houve efeito da sua passagem, né, na presidência, e que ainda dificulta bastante a circulação de livros.
Even though he's no longer in power, this censorship that occurred while he was, it still makes it difficult for the spread of books and literature.
Meu livro, O Avesso da Pele, foi censurado em 3 estados no início desse ano, proibido de ser lido nas escolas e bibliotecas.
My book, The Dark of the Skin, was censored in 3 different states, and it was also stopped from being published in school libraries.
O argumento utilizado é que era um livro pornográfico.
The argument that was used to justify the censorship was that the book was pornographic in nature.
Eu fiquei bastante curioso para encontrar essas cenas.
And I was very curious to find these pornographic scenes that were spoken of.
Mas a desculpa para a censura é porque alguns governos conservadores não querem discutir os problemas sociais como o racismo, por exemplo.
But this is an excuse that conservative governments come up with in order not to be able to tackle the real issue, such as an example, the racism.
mas diferente de outros tempos, houve uma reação muito forte, muito contundente, e os livros voltaram para as escolas e voltaram também para as bibliotecas.
But unlike in previous times, this caused a very strong reaction with the people. And thanks to this reaction, the books were able to go back to the schools and to the libraries.
Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, I think when I think about the sort of double marginalization that you're talking about, for me, it brings up this sort of complexity of belonging, like what is belonging, and when you come from a people who has been through like multiple migrations, has made home in multiple places or been forced to leave multiple places, like what does belonging mean then? And you know, when I was talking to my dad, actually, you know, in the process of writing this book, and he said something. He told me about how, so when my family was expelled from Uganda, they attempted to go to India. They went to India actually on a ship. They got there and they got to India, and the Indian government said, "Well, you can't land here. You're not Indian." And they couldn't be in Uganda because they were not, you know, their papers had been ripped up. So where were they supposed to belong, right? They were now people of the sea, or stateless, or whatever you want to call it. But when my dad was telling me this story, he said to me, you know, too Indian for Africa, too African for India. And that line just, you know, stuck in my head, and I put it in the book. A character says it, but that's sort of, you know, what it means to me is, and then I'm, you know, sitting in my home in Toronto, born in Canada, and what does it mean to me then, you know, who I also have this like other layer, and what do I have claim to? Yeah, I don't have an answer. I think I'm just, you know, I'm always grappling with all of that.
Thank you. So we have time for 2 more questions. This gentleman has had his hand up. You're okay? Okay. Yes. And then at the back over there. And then there's more sessions with Janika and Jeferson, I think, tomorrow. So make sure you check your program out. Yes, please.
Thank you. My question is directed to you. I think from your book, there are very huge similarities with another book called We Are All Birds of Uganda. And there's a sense of being uprooted from where you call home and being sent to another place where you're not very familiar with. And this is going to be a bit personal, but I'm going to ask you, as a person who has lived this experience, you're born in a country where your parents did not belong in the beginning. What would you kind of advise other people living in the same situation? Because in the beginning of your book, when you write about the character, when they like stamp the papers, they're not remotely aware of the fate that lies ahead for them, and that's a lived reality right now in Kenya. There are so many people who are going to the Middle East and other countries in you know, under the nuance of jobs and other hopes for the future, and their lives change completely. So as a person who is now living another reality, what would you kind of share with people who might be going through the same thing?
Thank you for that question. And thank you for also making that connection between like what happened 100 years ago and what is currently happening now. I think that is so important to bring into the room, right? That it's always happening, that this history is like, it's this constant cycle. Thank you for bringing that into the room. How do I answer that? I think, well, first of all, for me, what has helped is writing about it and speaking about it. So, you know, not shying away from that truth and drawing that connection between the past and the present. And this book is all about, yes, like linking together the past and the present and learning from the past in order to move forward into our present. And so, you know, I think when we're thinking about the current migration crises that are happening, and that will continue to happen in this world that we're living in. The current exclusionary borders that are happening all across the world, drawing on our ancestral wisdom and our sort of lineages of resistance, which is something that I tried to do in the book. There's stories of resistance and student movements and protests and social movements in Uganda in the 60s, in Toronto in the 90s. We have been fighting the same things over and over, and we will continue to. And yeah, just drawing on that sort of that memory, that keeping that alive. I think that's what has been important for me.
I realized that my backs are like this, so if you can please keep it short, and then we'll do 2 short questions, 1 and then 2.
Okay. Thank you. My question is, how much creative freedom does a writer truly have when drawing from material from personal history? Not so much in the label of fiction or nonfiction, but whose story is this to tell? For instance, you mentioned having a line that one of your family members mentioned to you as a character. So if you could.
Quando eu começo a escrever, eu presto muita atenção na minha família e nas pessoas que estão próximas de mim.
When I begin to write, I pay a lot of attention to my family and those who are near me or close to me.
As pessoas não sabem, mas eu estou às vezes roubando frases e experiências dessas pessoas.
They don't know it, but sometimes I am stealing certain expressions, phrases, and sentences from them.
E depois, quando o livro é publicado, eu digo que não, que foi tudo invenção da minha cabeça.
And when the book is published, I tell them, no, this all came out of my mind. This is all my imagination.
Mas é importante prestar atenção nas pessoas próximas e nos familiares, porque a nossa memória também está intimamente ligada a essas pessoas.
But it is very important for us to pay attention to our family and those close to us, because even our memories, they are very deeply linked to sad people.
Por exemplo, até aos 4 anos de idade, nós não temos uma memória da infância.
For example, until the age of 4 years old, we don't form memories of our childhood.
Então, se o pai, ou a mãe, ou um tio disser que nós fizemos coisas terríveis até os 4 anos, nós temos que acreditar neles.
So if an uncle, a father, or a mother tells us that we've done horrible things up until we were 4 years old, we have to believe them and trust them.
Portanto, escrever também é não ter medo do que a família vai achar do que você escreveu.
So writing is also not being fearful of what your family and friends might think of what you've written.
Lembro que no meu primeiro livro, que se chamava O Beijo na Parede,
I remember my first book, which is named The Kiss on the Wall.
Minha mãe leu antes de ser publicado e ficou 3 dias sem falar comigo.
She read the book before it was published and she spent 3 days without talking to me.
Porque ela estava muito impactada com a história, e quando eu perguntei por que ela estava impactada, ela disse: eu não te criei para você falar tantos palavrões num livro.
When he asked her, she felt very impacted by what was written in the book. And when he asked, or when I asked, what impacts you so much out of what I've written, and she replies, I didn't raise you for you to say so many swear words in a book.
Portanto, conselho para quem quer escrever: esqueçam a família.
So an advice to all of you who want to become writers: forget your family.
Thank you.
Should I answer or should we move on?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Okay, I will keep it brief, but it is something I thought a lot about when I was writing this book, because I thought, who am I to, my family doesn't speak about these things for a reason, because it's hard for them. So who am I to come in and sort of kick up that dust and try to talk about it? And my sort of answer to that was, well, if I want to write about it, then I have to recognize who I am writing about it, recognize the privilege of distance that I have, being one generation removed from this. And I also have to do my best to do it justice. And for me, doing it justice meant doing the work. So it meant speaking to my family, speaking to my community, doing as much research and reading as possible, to try to accurately portray what I could. And at the same time, I think there is such an element of fearlessness that is necessary, because I was not only trying to portray a story that my family or community would be comfortable with, I also wanted to tell the truth, right? And the truth is not always pretty. In fact, it's often very ugly. And I was afraid that people would say, you're airing our dirty laundry. Like, why are you? But at the end, I thought, well, my responsibility is yes to my family, yes to my community. My responsibility is also to the truth, and my responsibility is to the story. And yeah, I think holding all of those things at once felt important to me. So there are ways that I really wanted to honor my family and some of the words that they said to me while I was writing this book or researching it, and honor their experiences. And at the same time, I think it does us a disservice if we sugarcoat. That makes us less human. And I'm not in the project of making us less human. And so I was going to also honor the truth.
And I have to say, as someone whose own family history has similar resonances, I think for me what was really striking was there are moments of deep unflinchingness and a bumping up against a type of story that we don't often, or that I haven't often encountered in literature from this world or from this space, and part of which I think we're still grappling with in this moment. I really don't want to say it because I don't want to give out spoilers, but when you reach the moment, I think you'll know. And so just to say thank you for looking at it head on and speaking it. All right, this side of the room, I've been generously given 5 more minutes. So one there and then one here. And then we're gonna have to call it. I'm so sorry.
My question goes out to Jefferson. I was wondering why you used the Orisha and Ogun in that excerpt that Aleya read. The Orisha and Ogun gods.
The question is why, right? Yeah, the question around why you used the Orisha and the Ogun in that first beginning.
Eu tenho uma família bastante religiosa, uma família que cultua orixás em terreiros de Umbanda e Candomblé. Terreiros de Umbanda e Candomblé.
Umbanda e Candomblé.
É isso.
So I have a religious family that is related to lands of Umbanda.
Umbanda e Candomblé.
Umbanda e Candomblé. And Candomblé.
E na minha religião, eu sou filho de Ogum.
And in my religion, I'm the son of Ogun.
Que é um orixá, no Brasil, né, um orixá guerreiro, um orixá que fabrica as próprias armas.
And this is a orisha who's a warrior who creates weapons.
E na minha... no meu modo de escrever, de certo modo, eu também crio as minhas armas quando estou escrevendo.
And in my writing, I also create my weapons when I'm writing.
Mas é preciso ter cuidado com as armas que você mesmo fabrica para você não se ferir também.
But you need to be careful so that the weapons you produce are not the same weapons that are going to later hurt you.
E por isso a importância de colocar esse orixá no início da história e depois no final da história.
So that's why it's important to bring this Orisha at the start of the story and also at the end of the story.
Porque existe uma pequena história sobre o Ogum que tem a ver com essa estrutura que eu escolhi para escrever.
Because there is a small story related to Ogun that's related to the structure in which I chose to write on.
Certo dia, Ogum estava fabricando as suas armas.
Once upon a time, Ogun was making his weapons, creating his weapons.
Então, um menino que se perdeu dos seus pais pediu ajuda para Ogum.
So a boy who got lost from his parents, he asked for some help from Ogun.
Ogum não queria ajudar o menino, mas deixou os seus afazeres e foi ajudá-lo.
Ogun didn't want to help this boy, but even then he left his weapon crafting and decided to help the boy.
E disse: eu vou ajudar você a encontrar os seus pais.
I will help you. He said, I will help you find your parents.
E levou ele até no meio da floresta e chegaram na beira de um precipício.
He took him to the forest and they reached the edge of a precipice or an abyss.
E disse: os seus pais estão do outro lado, é só atravessar.
And he told the child, your parents are on the other side. You just have to get across the precipice or across the abyss.
E o menino olhou para Ogum, mas como eu vou conseguir atravessar um precipício?
So he looks to Ogun, the child looks to Ogun and asks, how am I going to be able to make it through this precipice?
Então Ogum pega o menino no colo, se agacha e dá um salto junto com o menino até o outro lado.
So Ogun grabs the child, squats, and gives a jump to the other side.
E disse: os seus pais estão naquela direção.
And he told the child, your parents are on that side.
Isso significa que os orixás nos ajudam a atravessar os abismos e precipícios.
So this symbolizes that the orishas, they help us go through these precipices and abysses that we face throughout our lives.
É isso.
Thank you. One last very tiny question.
Question for Jeferson. When The Dark Side of Skin was censored in Brazil, you took to social media and basically chided the act of censorship for your book, but also generally in Brazil. I'm wondering what your personal relationship with censorship has become since then and how it is weaving into your life as a writer, making work.
Atualmente é o assunto que eu mais falo nos festivais no Brasil.
Currently, this is the topic I speak the most of in festivals in Brazil.
E também serve para os discursos políticos, porque temos eleições municipais no Brasil.
And this also helps with political speeches because we have municipal elections at Brazil.
Políticos da ultradireita têm dito que O Avesso da Pele é um livro pornográfico e que será enviado para as crianças caso os partidos de esquerda sejam eleitos.
The far left claims that far right. Yes.
Oh, very important.
An important clarification.
sorry. Far right. The far right parties, they claim that this is a pornographic books, and if the far left or the left overall, if they win the elections, these books are going to be presented to their children.
Então, o modo que eu tenho trabalhado nos festivais e quando eu tenho a oportunidade de falar é dizer que é mentira e dizer o que de fato é o livro, que é, na verdade, uma história sobre várias questões, mas não é pornográfico.
So during the festivals, I try to explain to everyone that this is a book, yes, but it's not pornographic in nature. So what the far right claims about the book is not true.
Porque pornográfico é a violência e o racismo que acontece com as pessoas negras todos os dias no Brasil.
Because what's truly pornographic is the violence and racism that happens to people in Brazil on a daily basis.
Thank you. We really could go on for hours. I want to thank you both so much for your beautiful work. and for the generosity today and your wonderful company and insights and thoughts. And all of you, thank you for also filling the space with such generosity and care. I hope that you will read the work. Both Janika and Jeferson are around, and at Cheche there will be book signings, and their books are available also at, I think, Nuria and possibly. So, and just to say, enjoy the rest of the festival, keep hope alive, and solidarity and tenderness. And thank you. Good afternoon, everyone.